All right, it's KC 101. Time for another edition of Saturday with Seniors, and I'm with Dr. Bair here in Wellsboro. And how are you today, Doctor?
Just fine, thank you.
Well, good. So tell our listeners how old you are, Dr. Bair.
103.
103 years old. So you were born in what year?
1920.
Wow. And where were your parents originally from? Let's go back to them. Were they immigrants into the United States at that time?
No, they were born in Lambertville, New Jersey.
And then how did your parents end up in Tioga County?
They didn't.
They didn't? Okay.
I did.
You did. Okay, so you were the first generation to come to Tioga County.
Yes.
And what year did you come to Tioga County?
1955.
So 1955. Let's go back in your life when you were first born. What were some of your first memories? You know, your young years, your schooling years.
It was during the Depression, of course. We lived in the southern section of the town below the creek, and that was the people who were less fortunate than the people who lived above the creek.
So it was one side of the tracks or the other side, but the creek was the tracks in this place.
That's right. Instead of the tracks, it was a creek.
And what did your parents do for work when you were a kid?
My father mostly clerked in a grocery store, or ran a grocery store part of the time.
And do you remember that grocery store?
Sure.
How does it compare to today's grocery stores?
Nothing like it. It was a store where they had a clerk, and the clerk got the stuff for you, put it on the counter, and then packed it for you.
So good old-fashioned service back then. And probably $1 would buy a few things at the store back then, as opposed to today. You'd be lucky to find one thing.
Probably.
So what was your first job?
My first job, I guess, was a paper boy.
And so you remember going house to house with the newspaper? And back then, the newspaper was super important.
13 years old.
And then from there, what was your first regular type job besides the newspaper, full-time job?
I worked as a clerk in a co-op store in New Hope.
Did I hear you had a job chopping ice to pay one of your bills?
When I was 13 years old, I worked in an ice house. The boss would come in, go to the big ice house and get 300-pound cakes of ice and bring them into our smaller ice house. And then it was my job to cut off how much the people wanted. I had to kind of judge, and it wasn't an accurate way of doing anything, but that's the way we did things.
Almost like the deli, but with ice. Now, I've never had an ice box, but I assume you had an ice box back then and people bought ice for it?
Yes.
So where did the ice come from? Was this hand cut from the lakes?
They had an ice house in Lambertville, New Jersey, right across the river from New Hope.
And then how often did you have to refill an ice box? Since I never had one, I have no idea. Did the Iceman come?
Every day.
Every day the Iceman would come.
Yes, I think my mother would put out how much she needed. 50 pounds or 25 pounds was the usual.
And was that expensive to keep replacing the ice every day? I mean, when you got electricity, was it like, hey, this is going to save us work or save us money? Or what was the excitement about electricity versus the ice box?
Well, it was much more regular.
How did you get ice cream back when you were a kid, or frozen things? Because an ice box couldn't keep things frozen, right? It would just keep them cold.
That's just keep them cold. You didn't buy the ice cream until you were ready to use it.
And that's how it worked.
Yeah. And then we'd go down to the ice cream store, and they had a big thing, and the owner would dip out, say you wanted a quart of ice cream, and he would dip it out of his big freezer and put it in a quart box for you.
And you'd enjoy it then, or not later, because it was just then?
Well, then we'd take it home, and our family would have ice cream that night.
Wow. Let me switch gears a little bit back to your schooling days. What kind of school did you go to? Was it a one-room schoolhouse?
No.
No? Okay, so in New Jersey, there were...
Just 2 or 3 rooms.
Okay, that was a big school. What happened in school when you got in trouble? When in your 2 or 3 room schoolhouse, if not that you got in trouble, but if somebody else did, what was the discipline?
Well, I was not an exception. And they had a paddle with a board, had a handle on it, and it was about 6 or 8 inches wide.
Couple feet long, and you get a few whacks with that if you...
Yep. Sometimes you got a couple, and sometimes you got more than a couple.
Now, were you more afraid of that happening at school, or when you got home and the parents had to talk with you about what happened at school?
I was not afraid of that. I didn't want my dad to find out about it.
Okay. And there wasn't any telephones then, really, or was there when you were a kid?
Oh, there were telephones, but we didn't have any.
They were just in some select places? What did you have to do if you had to make a phone call, or did you ever make a phone call in those years?
Oh, yeah. There's a family 2 doors above us, the only telephone in our end of town. So anytime anybody had an emergency or something, they'd knock on their door and say, "Can we use your telephone?" They were always very generous about it.
So back then when the phones rang, was it a party line that you had?
Not this one. My aunt was on a party line, though. And if it maybe 2 longs and a short, 2 shorts and a long, or 3 shorts or 3 long.
So if you made a phone call, you wouldn't call direct. You would talk to the operator and they would connect your call?
At one time, yes, but that was really early on.
So you came to Wellsbury, you said 1955 to Tioga County?
Yes.
What decided to have you move here? Had you been here before?
In 1952, I took the first vacation I'd had for a long time, and so we happened to come to Wellsboro, and I liked it very much. It was August, the last 2 or 3 weeks in August, and one day we got up and there was frost on the ground, almost like snow.
In August?
Yeah.
And that didn't scare you away?
Well,
A little bit.
as we left, my wife said, "You'll never get me back here again."
But she came, right?
And she came, yes.
Where was your first house at?
We lived in the 2nd floor apartment right on the corner of Charleston and Everence.
Is that house still standing to this day?
Yes.
Yeah. So you drive by, sometimes you look at it. And
Oh, yeah.
So what did you do for fun back in your earlier days? What were some of your favorite things?
Well, my wife joined the music club, and I always enjoyed music. I enjoyed singing. So we got very interested in that. And then I was president of the Community Concerts Organization for quite a few years when we brought in professional singers. Rosa Hamilton was very good. She was a professional singer at one time. And then when she retired, she came back to Wellsboro, and she gave voice lessons. Mm-hmm. And I always liked to sing. Wouldn't say I had a good voice, but I loved it.
Sure.
And so I got very friendly with Rosa, and I asked her if she would be interested in giving me lessons. And sure.
So she was quite well known and quite famous, and you were privileged to have her as your teacher.
Yep, she was famous at one time. She sang at the funeral of President Woodrow Wilson.
Wow. I did not know that.
And the first radio broadcast made out of KDKA in Pittsburgh.
That's the first licensed radio station in the country, and she was on the first broadcast from Wellsboro. Now you're talking my kind of history here.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Now, do you remember when you first came to town, some of the businesses that were on Main Street, the Paxton's Five and Dime, and
Yep.
Dunham's, of course, was there then, but I think Dunham's is about the only one that's still on Main Street from when you were here. What were some of the other ones?
Well, there was another clothing store. For 4 months, we couldn't find an apartment, so we stayed at the Penwells Hotel.
That was your temporary housing for 4 months?
Yes.
Wow.
It was enjoyable. We
Yeah.
had a good time, and I don't know if you knew Frank Vaughn. He was a teacher at the high school, taught English, and he was a good musician. He played the organ down for the hotel. They had an organ. They played it every night during the dinner hour, so we got quite well acquainted with him, and he was studying to take his graduate school boards, and I was studying to take my surgical boards. So we'd get together evenings and do nothing but study. And then about 10 o'clock, my wife would make us coffee, and he'd have his coffee, and he'd go home.
Wow. That's neat. We're going to be right back after this commercial break. We're talking with Dr.